Hi, in this video I'm going to give you a quick introduction to using Nunit with Visual Studio. I've already prepared a mock-up WPF application for us to work with, so I'll just go ahead and load that up. And basically what I did was add two classes to it. There's a math handler class and a text handler class, and they're the two classes that I actually would like to test with the Nunit libraries. Let's go and have a quick look at the maths handler class just to get an idea of what we're going to be working with. You can see there I've created a function called add, and it takes two integer values and returns the sum. So we'd actually like to go ahead and write some Nunit test code to see that that function is working the way we anticipate it should. Now I could write that test for Nunit directly inside the class or inside this particular project. But what I'm going to do to make it easier for managing the code is I'm going to create a new project within this solution and then put all my Nunit testing in there. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to right click on solution and I'm going to add a new project. The type of project I need is just simply a class library because I'm not going to be testing any of the graphical user interface for the WPF app. I just want to test those two classes I've created, the maths and the text handler. So I'm going to go ahead and select class library. For a name for this project, I'm going to use the same name as the main project, but I'm going to just prefix it with test. So I'll call it test my application. When you create a class library, it also creates a default class file for you, which is called class1. Again, I want to try and stick with some good naming conventions here, so I'm going to rename that class to test maths handler. So I'll just right click on it and say rename, and we'll call it test maths handler. Okay. Now at the moment our new project, our test my application, doesn't know about Nunit at all, and it also doesn't know anything about our main project called my application. So we'll need to fix that up now. First of all, Nunit will need to add some libraries from NuGet. So I'm going to right click on references and manage NuGet packages. I'm going to do a search online for Nunit. Now Nunit can work with the console if you wish, but I'm going to show you how to use it with a graphical user interface. So for that reason I'm going to have to add two libraries. The first one is actually the main framework or the core, so we'll install that. And the second one will be the Nunit test adapter. This is going to allow us to use some of the built-in test capabilities inside Visual Studio with Nunit. Okay, they've both been installed successfully, so I can close the NuGet. The other thing I had to remember was to add a reference to the main project so that in fact our test project can see those two classes we want to write tests against. So to do that, inside the test application I'm going to right click and say add reference. I'm going to choose projects, solution. There's my main project there, so I'll put a tick next to it and say OK. So now our test application knows what to do with Nunit, and it can also see our main project. Probably a good point now just to save what I've been doing and just do a build to make sure we haven't made any mistakes. Okay, so it's built successfully. So now we can go ahead and actually start writing our Nunit code. First of all, with this class, the test maths handler, I need to tell Nunit that this will in fact be a class specifically for tests for Nunit. So I'm going to add an attribute, and it's going to be called test fixture, and this is part of the Nunit framework library. So when you add the test fixture, you'll also have to add a using statement for Nunit framework. Now we can go inside the class and actually get ready to start writing our code for testing. First thing I'm going to do is add another attribute called test. This is to tell Nunit that the method I'm about to write is in fact the test we need to perform. The method I'm going to write is public. And for naming, I'm going to use, again, the same naming conventions as what I've done up till now. So if we look at the mass handler library, the original one, you recall that it had a function called add. So I'm going to call this one test add. Now we're going to need to be able to call the original function, so I'm going to need to make an instance of that. The original class was called mass handler, so let's pull that up and we'll make an instance called mh, like so. And now I'm ready to actually write the test. This is the bit of code that does all the magic, if you like, and most of them start with assert, then a dot, then the type of test that you want to perform. The one I'm going to be using is r equal. Inside r equal, I have to give two values. The first value is what I expect the test should give back as the correct answer. So let's say that we expect to get the answer 20 to come back. Then we put a comma, and then we put the second part, which is actually the code that we want to run that's going to give us that result, the bit of code we want to test. So that will be inside mh.add, and if you recall, that particular function had two values that you pass to it, and then it returned the result. So if I pass 10 and 10 to my mass handler add function, I should expect to get back 20 if all goes well and my code's working correctly. Okay, that looks good. So I'm just going to again save at this point, and I'll do another build just to make sure everything's okay. Looks great. Alright, but we can't at this point see our actual test running. To do that, I actually have to bring up a new window. And the place you'll find it is under the test menu. Go down to Windows and bring up the Test Explorer. As soon as you do that, you'll see that we now have our new test that we just wrote here called test add displayed, with an exclamation point to say it hasn't yet been run. If you don't see this, then there's a fair chance you've forgotten to add that second library in the NuGet. So just review this video and find the library and add it in. What I'm going to do now is run the test and see if in fact we do get back 20 when we run our add function. So I'll click on Run All. And we can see we've got a green tick, and we even get a little bit of an idea of how long it took for the test to be executed. But the bottom line is we have passed. So that's all good. Let's go ahead and have a look at the text handler class and see if we can write some test code for that as well. Let's close those two windows. Okay, so this is the text handler class from our main project. You can see we have a function called makeUpperCase, accepts the string value, and it returns the string in all uppercase. So we're going to write a test for this. Again, we'll go to test my application. I'm going to add a class, and we'll call this one test text handler. We'll make that public. And the function we're going to be testing is called makeUpperCase. So let's go ahead and fix things up. If you recall, we have to put an attribute at the top above the class, which is test fixture. That also adds a using for the framework. Then inside the class we write the test attribute as well, and then we write the actual method. So I'm going to call this one, just making sure I got that. The function name again was makeUpperCase, so we'll call this one test makeUpperCase. Now we're ready to actually go ahead and write the code for testing. Again, oops, before we do that, we've got to create a instance of the we're going to create an instance of the text handler. So let's do that first. Then we can go ahead and write the test, so it's going to be assert, and I'm going to do the same thing, r equal. You could also use r same. So what I'm going to do here is put in what I'm expecting, which is going to be, makes uppercase. So we're expecting Daniel, all uppercase, and the actual function that should do all that is called th major uppercase. Okay, so let's save our changes. We'll build our project again just to make sure we haven't done anything silly. Nope, that's passed. Let's have a look over here in our test explorer. You can see now that we've got a new test appeared here, which is the one we just wrote. I'm going to run them both again so they won't take too long, and we'll see what happens. And there you go. You can see that now we have both tests working and pass. Now, if you didn't get the right result, you'll obviously have a fail there. So if you want to see what that looks like, let's say, for example, that we pass Dan and we expect to get back Daniel. Save our changes and let's run those tests again. And you'll notice it says passed, but oh no, it's come back. Okay. Now you'll see that it's got one test failed. So we can see that the test make uppercase didn't actually succeed. If we actually click on it, we also can read a little bit of a message about what it thought went wrong. So it was expected a string length of 6, but in fact got a string length of 3. So I expected Daniel and got back Dan. So actually that message is really quite useful for us because it actually does give us a very good idea of what went wrong in this particular instance. Let's go ahead and correct our test. And let's run it again. And now both our tests have completed successfully. Let's look at one other variation of doing tests. So I'm going to go back to the main project and pull up the text handler for a moment. And let's say that we intend to write another function. So the function we're going to write is make lowercase. It's going to accept a string value. And in here it's going to convert whatever we put in to make it lower case. But we haven't yet written the code for that. So what we've done instead is we're throwing a not implemented exception. Okay, because we haven't got around to actually writing that function yet. So we want to test it. Now of course the problem is it's not going to actually return a result. It's going to throw an exception. So what we are going to have to test for at the moment at least is for that exception to come back. So here's how we do it. Let's go back to our text handler here and let's add a second test. This one being of course for that new function that we haven't yet finished writing. Okay. Both of these are going to be using the text handler, so I'm just going to change the scope of that instance and put it up there so they can both see it. Now in the case of exceptions we do have to add another attribute, which I'm going to put down here below the test, and that's going to be what is called a expected exception. In other words, this is going to throw an exception and we need to tell NUnit what type of exception it should expect. So we'll say type of, and in this case it should get back not implemented exception. Because we're doing an exception rather than a valid function, we don't have to put an assert in here. You can, but this is an easier way of doing it. So all I'm going to do here is simply call our function that we haven't finished writing yet, passing a value like I would expect to, and what should happen is when we call that function, it should actually throw the exception. This will then check for that exception, and if it does find the matching exception, it will show it as a pass. So we'll save our changes and run all again. And we can see that in fact it did pass, which is great. So when we get around to actually writing the text handler make lowercase function, we can put the correct code in there, and then we'll have to come back in here and obviously write a new test. If we forget to write the new test, then as soon as we change the code in here and we try and run our test unit tests again, we'll actually get a fail on this one anyway, so we'll know there's a problem and it won't take too long for us to figure it out. There are a lot more tests that you can do in NUnit, but all of them seem to follow a very similar convention. So if you look at these two examples, you've got a really good guide of where to start. I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the website for NUnit, which is www.nunit.org, and have a look at the documentation. You'll find some other examples there of the different types of tests that you can run. You'll also find there's a few YouTube videos up as well from different people that have used NUnit. I hope you found the video useful, and we'll see you on the next one.
Well, interviewing Dan the boat.
I kind of like it.
Think about this.
Think about this. All your listeners, they, driving along and they listen, they go and they hear your voice, but they don't really yet to know the real you because you're giving like that blah 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 blah, and really they've got.
You've heard the show apparently.